Hello and welcome to another episode of DCU Daily. And today we're going to be talking about Paradise Lost. It's a new show that was announced under that whole big presentation that James Gunn and Peter Safran did a while ago. And it's meant to be part of this chapter one of the DCU. And basically, it's a prequel. It's a prequel to Wonder Woman, and it takes place on the island of Themyscira in the Amazons. And it's been described by Peter Safran and James Gunn as basically DC's Game of Thrones, which on the surface sounds fantastic, but there's also potentially some downsides to that. So we'll be talking all about that and so much more. But before we do that, I do want to mention something else first, and that's towards the end of our show yesterday, we got a comment in the chat that we didn't have a chance to address, and I told the commenter that hey, we're gonna address it today. So he or she was asking, how would you address the introduction of Jonathan Kent in the DCU. And yesterday, just for context, John, you and I we were talking about
Mhm.
um, basically the authority and how they're gonna fit into the DCU, and we had sort of mixed in a little bit of like Superman because like we get the sense that because the engineer is in Superman Legacy, the authority is gonna be attached to the Superman mythos somehow in this new universe, and they're probably gonna cross paths a few times. So, as I think, by virtue of that conversation, I think we got a comment from one of our viewers, and they were asking about how would you introduce Jonathan Kent, the who in the comics is the son of Superman, into the DCU. Now, the DCU, of course, hasn't even kicked off yet, so and I don't think the Clark Kent we're gonna be meeting is gonna be old enough to necessarily have a son yet, or even be married. So my question is for you, John. Like, well, how would if A, how would you introduce them? B, is it too soon? And then C, let's say like 10 years into the DCU, kind of like where the MCU has been for the last little while, do you think DC will take a similar approach where instead of like rebooting, they're just gonna go like, okay, well now the main Superman is sort of and taking a backseat because for some reason maybe he has his own Iron Man moment, and now Jonathan Kent becomes like a Superman. So yeah, so like I guess all of that. How would you address that question?
Yeah, it is a bit much thinking about it right now because as you said, it's like we haven't, even gotten anything yet. We haven't even gotten Creature Commandos, and that's supposed to come out this year. So, you know, um, I think Jonathan Kent is a really great character. He's a really interesting character. And one of the reasons why I'm not like totally on board with Damian Wayne being the Robin in Brave and the Bold is because we don't get that dynamic, unfortunately, because one of the best things that like one of the best things about Damian Wayne in terms of recently was his relationship with John Kent. And whether that was friendship or something more depends on, if you browse Wattpad or Tumblr a little bit too much. It I feel like we're kind of missing that dynamic, so it is kind of interesting how someone brought that up because I would love John Kent to appear. He is such a great character, and I liked how they just went with how they went with something like kind of like the same but different. I don't like what they eventually did because it infamously Dan DiDio doesn't like sidekicks. That's why Wally West kind of got sidelined. That's why Dick Grayson became Rick Grayson and all that. The less said about that, the better. So he kind of got gypped in terms of that aspect. But I would love to see John Kent again, like ways down the line, maybe in like chapter 3 or something like that, chapter 3 or 4, if we hopefully get to that point. I would like to see him. I would like to see like, sort of maybe we get a Superman film, or even a show or something Superman related, whether that be like Superman, Supergirl, a Lois Lane show, a Daily Planet show, whatever they have planned, and like a good like final like episode or a final like moment in the movie would be like Lois Lane showing Clark a pregnancy test. I think that would be like obviously a good visual, and we would get pumped for John Kent. I because I like that character, and if anybody who hasn't seen it, Battle of the Super Sons, yeah, the animation's a little wonky and a little weird to look at, but they that movie was fantastic, and anything with the Super Sons is just great, and so there is kind of something we're gonna have something missing there because as well as the fact that Tim Drake is the best Robin, he should have been the Robin of the DCU, but that's just my opinion. But so we could like save Damian Wayne for when they both get introduced to see that. But you know, I would like to eventually. I know it's a little bit too early to like tell or but I think obviously that's such a because he became such a great, you know, character like straight out of the get-go. The only thing bad about him is the fact they aged him up way too quickly before they could like really do anything like proper with the character. But I think if like eventually you introduce him, keep him a kid for like a good long while, have him grow up organically and not like do what they did in the comics, then I think you should that should be golden and have like introduce that like, oh, Clark, guess what? Good news, like that kind of thing. I think that would be really great.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it because w- I always found that whole why he just kind of gets like you said like aged up very not naturally, and it makes him because the thing is in most movies and most stories we tend to see the trope of somebody getting artificially aged up as usually that's an antagonistic force because they're sort of cheating the order of nature, right? And
Yeah.
whereas the person on the right side, the good, the righteous side of everything good usually is taking the long way to get there. So I definitely think that while we've had a few iterations of Jonathan Kent, whether it's in Superman Lois, where you get a younger version,
Hmm.
or the one that we got in Titans, where you get that teenage angsty version. Um, I don't think we've gotten a definitive one yet because, like you said, in the comics they've sort of had some missteps of the character, so I think there's a potential for somebody like a James Gunn whoever chooses to do a project with Jonathan Kent as a character down the road to give us the best iteration yet, comic books or otherwise.
Hmm.
Because the character has a lot of potential, especially because like I think ultimately that character would be built up to basically fill the shoes of Superman, the definitive superhero, like no whichever comic book
Right.
you're reading. So there will be a lot of pressure, and it's kind of like the same thing as with Marvel, right? Right, like I love you 3000, and like that scene is like iconic, and of course, like they hint enough that the Iron Man tech may eventually land with a newer generation, whether it's Ironheart or Peter Parker and Tom Holland Spider Man. But the most likely or the most naturally fitting heir to the throne would be his daughter, Tony Stark's daughter. But she's only like what, like 12 years old, maybe
Yeah.
in that movie in Avengers Endgame. So and that movie takes place in 2023, even though it came out in 2019. So that's technically like just this past year. So I would imagine that if she were to grow up and become a superhero, we probably would have to wait another 10 or so years, unless Marvel decides to do another time jump. Otherwise, it would just feel out of place. Even for like a young Avengers team, I think she would be like too young to potentially be in there. So I think that we need a similar maybe path, and like you said, the he has to for the Superman first has to get hitched. He has to have or he it doesn't have to get a hitch first. I suppose like in whichever order it goes, he first has to have a baby, and then that baby has to grow up. So there's a lot
Exactly. Yeah.
that has to happen. And actually, I personally, I think that if they did this, the best way to do this would be if they turned it into like a TV series, like start him off, maybe introduce him in a movie, a Superman film, but then let him have his own like the path to discovering life and the world that he's a part of and the role that he plays in it, being this superpowered person, kind of like what Clark Kent had to do, and let that journey take place over the course of like a TV series. Maybe it doesn't need to be a multi-season arc. Maybe it could be just one season, like a mini series that helps you set up the character, and then you bring him into the movies. Because if you just introduce him and then kind of rush him through that process, then I think that would be like what you said, Jonathan. Sorry, John. I almost called you Jonathan because Jonathan on the mind.
Definitely not
Um,
Jonathan.
Yeah, I think the worst thing they could do is rush that character. But hopefully, we answered your question. And thanks for leaving a comment last week, not last week, yeah, yesterday in our show. And if there's more comments like that, of course, we'll address them. We'll try to get to the live comments during the show. I'm just going to make a quick round here. It doesn't look like we have a comment or question, at least, that's looking for an answer yet. So that means we can just jump straight into our main topic. So the main topic today, as I mentioned earlier, is Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost is meant to be a prequel series that I think they mentioned could be like taking place as much as 1,000 years before the present day Wonder Woman era. And while we don't really know where or how Wonder Woman fits into the DCU picture yet, and they're well, Gal Gadot still thinks she's going to be continuing to play the character. James Gunn and Peter Safran have not really contradicted that at all, although some insiders at Warner Brothers have said no, we're kind of moving on. But there's really no clarity there. So Paradise Lost doesn't really have to worry about that too much, because I highly doubt there's going to be any flash forwards. I mean, there could
Yeah,
be, but like it's unlikely. Um, but the comparison with Game of Thrones is really intriguing. So what do
yeah,
you think about the fact that they pitched it as this is DC's Game of Thrones? And by the way, when they said that, I believe House of Dragon was on air, right? So
yeah,
it was around so the whole, because the last season of Game of Thrones were pretty controversial, and a lot of people did not like it, although some people did, but not everybody. But then House of Dragon comes out, and House of Dragon is like almost universally beloved. It's like one of the
yeah,
biggest shows of the year. It was breaking records upon records, and the second season is I think in production now. So there's certainly an appetite for more of that brand of content, and when you mix it up with like the mythos of the Amazons and Themyscira, I definitely think there's a lot of potential there to create some great stories, and also maybe even just pick some stories from the comics and adapt them. So where do you stand on that comparison, that they're kind of going for the Game of Thrones vibe, but also do you think that Game of Thrones comparison kind of pigeonholes it and maybe limits them a little bit creatively? Because now that they have made such a bold statement, if they go in a pretty different direction, do you think fans are going to be like, "But wait, this was supposed to be the Game of Thrones"? Like it's kind of, what I'm trying to say is it as much of a blessing as it is a curse to kind of be pitched as the way that they pitched the show?
yeah. I think because the thing is, obviously you have to like come up with like something like it was during the big announcement, and you got to come up with something like just to like give an idea to be like, okay, this is what the show is going to be like the tone. And that's fine. It just like I feel like a lot of like people kind of just ran with that like, oh, it's just gonna be DC's Game of Thrones, where I'm like, no, that's not necessarily gonna be the case. And I feel like that, as you said, pigeonholes it because it's I feel like it should be more than that. And um and it's kind of like a con on both sides where it's like, okay, sure, yes, House of the Dragon is going really good right now and only has one season under its belt, but I've heard nothing but great things about it. And the thing is, if you have like DC's Game of Thrones, then okay, you're just gonna have comparisons to House of the Dragon, one, and two, it might seem like repetitive. So it's like, okay, that's like kind of not really interesting. And then on top of that, like if you compare it to Game of Thrones, like the actual Game of Thrones, not like the universe of like Song of Ice and Fire, but like just Game of Thrones, the show, then it might not be great because people might shoo it off because it's like, oh, well, Game of Thrones season 8 sucked, so we're not gonna like bother with this, which is kind of a bit detrimental. Now, I think obviously you can have that medieval tone, but sometimes, well, just because it's a medieval tone doesn't need to be, Game of Thrones or even Lord of the Rings, because I think it should be its own identity. Because there's lots of medieval fantasy, lots of great medieval fantasy that isn't those two biggest franchises. There's a lot more than that. Like you even have like, Dungeons and Dragons and like Warhammer and all that stuff. So you can like obviously get tons of like inspiration from different things and create just something totally new. Obviously the comics as well. I don't know if there's ever been like a Wonder Woman like prequel comic. Like, because I know that like there's stuff like with Superman and like Batman, like you have like a lot of like spin-off stuff. Like I know there was like Gotham Central for Batman, and then Superman more famously, you had Krypton in terms of shows, which unfortunately got canceled way too early, despite being a great show. And that's what I think this show should be. The in its own like obviously not like exactly like that because obviously it's sci-fi versus fantasy, but I think it should take that like where it's like this big world, like have like a bunch of like all this lore and just like kind of I don't want to say piggyback off that because again, try to be its own thing, but like Krypton like I feel like had its own way of doing things, like, it felt bigger than what it was, and, like, it had, like, a lot of these great ideas, and it didn't totally rely on, like, again, like, total like, each and every bit of comic lore. So, like, it did its own thing, and I think it should very much do that. I don't think it should just rely on that. So, what I think it should be is Krypton plus the best thing I can think of is, like, The Wire almost, and I'm not saying just saying that because it was an amazing show. I'm saying that because it's, like, I think it should be an ensemble cast, and I think it should be, like, all these different characters from, different ideas of what, like, they should be because a lot of, from what we've seen of Themyscira is, like, it's kinda samey, like, all the characters feel kinda the same. Because I mean, they're all, they're all stuck on this well, not I wouldn't say stuck because they love it there, but they're on this island, they're living kind of a similar way, but I feel like there's different kinds of warriors and different kinds of, worship of different things, like, I think it would be great there's, like, characters that are, you know, um, that are more in line with, archiving their history or or women who are, heavy into the warrior thing or heavy into the worship of the gods or heavy into like their own like sexuality and that kind of thing. I think if you get all those different aspects of these characters, that would be really, really interesting. And I feel like could feed into like this really big ensemble cast of like doing it right. And then on top of that, try not to use like the more notable characters that we've gotten, like Nubia, Artemis. Obviously, you can have them, but like maybe if we do have like a main protagonist, who I don't think should be Hippolyta either, should be like someone who is in the comics, but like not a lot, or maybe an entirely new character, and she's like surrounded by all these like characters that are more known. So I think it should like uh definitely be like that where it's just like all different types of characters and this sort of thing. And there was also another one more thing I wanted to bring up. There was I forget who did it. I think it was I don't know. There's this like famous like fan fiction world called Earth 27. It's on fandom. You could probably look it up. It's really interesting where he like combines different aspects of like pop culture like franchises and combines them into one. He started with DC and like the attributes of DC and then like kind of built. I forget that I think it Roy Westerman or something like that. He did a really good job. And one of his ideas was that there's different pockets of different types of um, islands depending on where they are. Like you can have like a more like African society, that's where Nubia is. And
Okay.
then you can have like that like Themyscira, whatever that like tie it into like African mythology. Or like Artemis, how she is more along the lines of like she's a redhead, more like Scottish Irish. You can have that like more it's off the like the coast of Ireland and have like Irish or even Scandinavian mythology, like bringing that in. I think that could be really cool. Like different aspects of mythology combined under this roof could also be really cool and interesting. Not my idea and not an original idea by me, but like I think that could also be really cool because that would definitely bring about some interesting lore that I think could be explored really well.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the influences you know just mentioned, I think are great sources to kind of pick and choose from. I personally think like one of the things they could do is they could potentially just go and like look at like Warner Brothers, of course, has Lord of the Rings in their back pocket. They're
Yeah.
trying to do more Lord of the Rings movies out there. I think that's a great one to pick from potentially because there's that his this ancient feeling story, an ensemble of characters. You've got the some characters. They're not all necessarily they are mostly humanoid. I think they're all humanoid, but they're not all humans. Like I think
Yeah.
we can go in so many different directions. I think that one of the things that I really loved recently was that Zack Snyder had this explanation. He was like, "Look, if he had a chance to kind of continue and finish, or take his version of the DCEU far enough, he would have eventually let us know that the Amazons were actually Kryptonians. They were like the descendants of those ancient Kryptons who came on that ship that landed like years
Mm.
ago. The one where Superman finds his suit in the Man of Steel. So I always like the idea of sort of connecting those pieces in a way because, like, in the real world, like what that we live in, it's like, for example, we have the period. This is gonna seem trivial, but like we have like the periodic table of elements, right? Like, there's hydrogen on there, helium, nitrogen, iron, all those things. They all look and behave the same way, no matter, and that's the reason why we kind of like believe that things are the way they are, and that's how they would be no matter where you are in the universe, is because we're like if you go anywhere in the universe, hydrogen will be the same thing no matter where you are. It will behave the same way at 100 degrees Celsius as it would at 0 degrees Celsius if the environmental conditions were the same on Earth or some planet like 100 million light years away. And there's a certain level of simplicity to which things boil down to in the world that we live in. And I think like in the world of the movies, and especially these comic book movies, where I get a little annoyed is when they start to like for example in the Phase 4 of the MCU, they've been doing this thing where in every different like project that tackles the multiverse, to tackle it in some different way. Where like the way the time variance authority describes the multiverse is very different than how they tackled it in Spider-Man No Way Home, or how they describe the alternate reality that Miss Marvel's powers come from and stuff like that. It's so crazily different. But I'm like, look, it should all be there should be a consistency, right? That's what I liked about the earlier phases of the MCU, where they were like, the Captain America's shield is made out of vibranium. It's the same vibranium you find in Wakanda, and it turns out that whereas Howard Stark only thought it'd be like it's the strongest metal in the world, the Wakandans know that it's more than just a metal. It can do a lot more than that, and that's because they've been mining it and they've been like infusing into other things, living things, and it has other properties and so on and so forth. So there's a common like thread. Like it's you can simplify, you can kind of boil it down, and I like the idea of kind of finding like what's the origin of the Amazons and Themyscira, and I think like that was also one of my favorite parts of like Zack Snyder's Justice League, is like seeing that whole fight sequence with Darkseid and his army, and I'm like, that was so freaking epic. Can you imagine if they had Paradise Lost build up to something like that? And because so far, like anything to do with New Gods has sort of been shelved. Like Ava DuVernay is no longer attached to anything
Right.
DC related as of now. We are sort of, I think that when we are getting the authority, in my opinion, is sort of like meant to be that alien like counter to your Justice League equivalent antagonistic force of characters, whereas I think the New Gods would have been positioned the same way if we were in the DCEU and they had managed to put the pieces together. Maybe not at the same exact way, but like in a similar way. But I would love to maybe see the New Gods somehow be introduced, like, so the first time we get an interaction with them and somebody on Earth is thousands of years ago. And then the seeds are planted, so then when the New Gods, like, eventually, because I guarantee you they'll eventually be a part of the DCU, and when that happens, there's like already a foundation built there. And it's not a foundation you established tens of 20 years ago in the real world. It could have been just been like 5 years from when the show comes out. They decide to do a New Gods project, and all of a sudden you've got some previous seeds planted in that universe. So
Right.
I would love to see that because Paradise Lost is like when they pitched this idea, I was like, you know what, you have infinite amount of possibilities because even if you just did what they did in the first two Wonder Woman movies, especially the first Wonder Woman movie, where we got a lot more of them there and a lot of what you described, like they showed people who are it's an entire society, so not they're all warriors in a manner of speaking, but they're not all like just training
They're
to be
not
warriors.
soldiers. They're all not like soldiers. They know
Exactly.
how to fight, but they're not like soldiers at heart.
Yes.
Like, because I just think that would just get a little bit too boring too quickly. I know Peter Safran brought up like how would this society be brought up? How like
Yeah.
where did this start? Where where's the like origin of all this? How do they like mingle? How do they, have fun? How do they do this and that? I think that's just a really good idea and stick with that. Um,
Yeah.
and I think, like, as long as you just don't as long as it's not, just Game of Thrones again and, oh, but with DC characters, I think they'll be fine, and I think,
Yeah.
they should really just stick with that, not just,
Yeah.
another good thing to bring up actually, because this was a controversial aspect of, of the New 52, I believe it was, I think it was in Brian Azzarello's run of Wonder Woman. And he brought up that, okay, how are there more, um, how do they keep getting, like, more and more women to, like, really do the society? Well, apparently that's where, like, the siren myth comes from, I think, what they did. I don't know, it's been a while since I, read it, but I believe it was they would, like, entrance, like, sailors and, like, take advantage of them and then, like, give birth to, like, women on the island, and then I think, like, cast out any, male, children, and I think that could be something that could be brought up. It would be super dark, and I don't know if they would wanna, like, go that far because that's kind of it's very messed up, but I think you could, like, bring that idea where it's not like, "Oh, this amazing, like, oh, society of women." I think you should, like, bring in those, like, flaws and darker aspects of, like, well, how do they keep getting people on this island? Well, it's not what you think it is, and it's not like, "Oh, we keep making our warriors out of clay. We keep making our people out of clay." It's like, okay, maybe it's something a lot more than that, and you could bring in those controversial aspects, and I think that um, could
Yeah.
be interesting as long as it's done correctly. Like, it's not like, obviously, like, gross and dirty for the sake of gross and dirty, like shock value type of thing, like just shock for the sake of shock. I think if you like
Yeah.
integrate that properly into the world, you could bring about those like really darker, flawed aspects of the society.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something which I've noticed a lot of the recent, like, Apple TV shows have done, especially, like, Apple TV Plus lives in the realm of sci-fi like no other streaming service in terms of just putting out quality stuff, and For All Mankind is one of those shows where it's an alternate history show that's also sort of a sci-fi show where, the Russians, the Soviets got to the moon first, and then that's their premise, and from that point forward, they look at and examine how things play out differently because the space race never ended because America was like we got to beat them at something, and then then they got to the next thing, and then Soviets were like, all right, we got to get to the next thing, and it just kept going. Unlike in real life, where the wall comes down, the Soviet Union kind of dissolves, and therefore the space race kind of dies out, and the NASA's budget gets reprioritized. So in this world, they're on the moon, they're going to Mars, like and there's all kinds of things happening, but despite like them doing some pretty fantastical things in the sense that they're still well into our future. Some of those things we haven't really done yet. We haven't even been back to the moon, at least not with humans stepping foot on the moon since the 70s. So having done that, however, they still base it, like, on around the characters. There's a lot of good character drama. There's a lot of, real things like, drug addiction or, like, marital issues and, like, couples going apart. Like, one of the couples, like, their son dies because he was riding his bike in the neighborhood and got hit by a car and did not survive. Like, and then they have to live with that and see how, and then they adopt a daughter, and you see that them, the family grow up over time, and other things happen, like one of the two kids, they lose both of their parents on a space mission because they were both astronauts and they both passed away on a space mission on the moon. So but like in a TV show format, you're able to take those things and then you're able to then show the consequences. You're able to show the cause and effect in a way that you can't really do in a movie. And like you said, like we can get into so many other aspects of their society on Themyscira that we never, would be able to really fit into a movie because they hinted at so much of that stuff in that first Wonder Woman movie, even though like
Yeah.
they were like, well,
Even in
like
that flashback in Wonder Woman 84 with, like, the race or whatever, which was
yes,
definitely really cool, but,
I would love that, like, because that could be, like, their version of Quidditch. I mean, I think that's what they were probably like, or Olympics, and maybe they were like, that's how the Olympics that's where the Greeks got the idea for the Olympics from, I don't know, I'm just or Greeks or Rome, I think it was the Greeks that were the Olympics
yeah.
is. But yeah, there's so many, like, different things, so many different inspirations, and I think ultimately putting yourself firmly I don't think they necessarily said that they wanted to do another Game of Thrones, I think or maybe that wasn't their intention, but putting yourself firmly in that tier, in that category, you're setting the bar pretty high for quality. Like whoever's gonna be working on the show, they better have the budget and the resources and the talent to produce something that doesn't necessarily need to be Game of Thrones esque. Although I feel like the material probably calls for at least a little bit of that, but it needs to have that quality level. It needs to give you those character-based stories, the drama, like the character arcs play out over multiple seasons. You have these large action fight sequences, like that are larger than life, things that you wouldn't imagine seeing in a TV show. Which nowadays there isn't much you can't imagine seeing in a TV show because TV shows are doing basically a lot of what you see in a movie, but there's still a certain level of grandeur that a movie provides that I think TV shows don't yet do. And I'm not saying this show needs to break that kind of ground. However, this show could do things and go places where no other superhero show has gone so far. Because when you look at it, ultimately DC and Marvel TV shows, even when they're on streaming services like Hulu, Disney Plus, HBO Max, or just Max, or even Netflix, like with the Sandman, they still don't have quite the scope of storytelling and the vastness of the characters and just the depth in which they're exploring those characters, like what you see on Game of Thrones, like what you see on For All Mankind. Like those shows still feel like they're or like The Last of Us, they're like a notch above, right? Like, um, I think with Paradise Lost and I think the DCU as a whole can start creating these shows that have a much larger scope. Because like a show like Waller, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, that's a show that will have a limited scope because it's I mean, well, I guess you could say it will have a limited scope because if it's just spoken like character, it wouldn't be going too many places, but we'll discuss that in more detail tomorrow. But then also there's stuff like Booster Gold. Like Booster Gold is probably it's just it's a show about Booster Gold, whereas Paradise Lost is a show about an entire civilization
Yeah.
and it's like it's much bigger than that and it could just they could even make it an anthology. Like it doesn't need to take place in just one part of their history, and like you said, we don't need to have a character that we have seen before in the comics or otherwise. That's what you and I both loved about Krypton, that they were going into places that we had never been before, and it just completely reframed the mythology of Superman. And then they took some creative liberties, which depending on which side of the fence you land on, whether you like it or not, at the end of the day, they still did something very different. And I think that while that show ended prematurely because of Sci-Fi's, financial restrictions and how much the show cost, and at the time, I don't think Max was quite set up to, take that show over and keep supporting it. I think moving forward, shows like that should be and of course Game of Thrones and all the other references that they're provided should be good guidance. And given that this will be on Max, and the fact that the Casey Bloys and his team are working closely with Peter Safran and James Gunn,
Mhm.
they know how to make TV. They've made some of the biggest, greatest TV shows of all time. So they've got the pedigree and their work. I mean, I can you know what? Like I think like once the Penguin comes out, people are gonna be like, yes, now that's how you do a spin-off TV show. So I am excited to see where Paradise Lost goes. Any last thoughts on your part? Anything that you missed on, or anything else you'd like to see from the show?
Yeah, I just, yeah, just don't be I think, like, I think a really cool way I keep going back to, like, 80s talk, but, like, go with, like, the really high fantasy stuff of, like, the 80s of, like go, like, full Excalibur with it. That would be really awesome. I think, just because I mean, because the thing is, I feel like there's also, like, the idea of, like, "Oh, it has to be dark and gritty because look at" Game of Thrones and, you know, Lord of the Rings. Like, as much as I majorly respect Lord of the Rings, it's just like there's something like kind of like missing of like the high fantasy of high fantasy, like where it's, you know, just that, you know, just the magic of it, I guess the charm and magic of it, like really bring that into. I think that could definitely be an attribute that would they
Yeah.
could really have fun with, like something that's not really brought up. I I never watched Game of Thrones. I know, terrible, but I never watched it. I never bothered with it. But even like the magic of some of like the more modern like medieval like fantasy tones is just kind of like not I wouldn't say, like, not there, it's just, like, not, like, fun. Like, it's not, like, because it's like, yeah, sure, you could, like, open up a whole can of worms. With magic, there's a lot of things you gotta think about in terms of magic, like, what can you do? What can't you do? But, like, really go heavy into that, especially if we're talking about variety in terms of, like, the movies. Why we Same thing for the TV shows, like, Waller is probably gonna be, like, you know, like, CIA, like, CSI, NCIS type of thing, maybe. I don't know. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. And then you have Booster Gold, which is gonna be like an action comedy. They got Lanterns, Cosmic, and then and then you have like the stuff that's like not attributed to the DCU. So I think like really going into like the magic of like what Wonder Woman can be, because I feel like that's like a major attribute that's like kind of forgotten. Like this is way different, but I would love to see a Superman movie where they show his vulnerability to magic. We haven't seen that yet. Like okay, I we get it. Apparently the entire planet of Krypton has made it to Earth with kryptonite. Like, how much kryptonite can there possibly be? Like, bring in some magic, bring in Felix
Yeah.
Faust, like bring in like some of the weirder characters, so that, or like Eclipso or something like that, where it's like really heavy in like that sort of magic to bring in more vulnerability for Superman, because everyone's like claiming like, oh, he's too OP. Well, not really, because you have like an entire realm that DC has barely tapped into that can bring in that vulnerability. And it's just like an intriguing thing. Like, I know the red and the green and the rot are like kind of like balancing between like science and magic. So like that could be really cool. Like there's a whole can of worms. Bring that some of that into Paradise Lost, because Wonder Woman is definitely one of those characters that's kind of like that bridge between the weirder magic stuff and like mainstream, because she was part of the Rebirth Justice League Dark for a little bit. So like do that. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Bring in more magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again they hinted that in the first Wonder Woman movie, right? They did have a few examples of that early in the film when they're on Themyscira. And then the lasso of truth is sort of treated like almost like magic in a way. Um, and even when she's trying to corral Superman in Justice League, both versions of it, he kind of goes for it for a little bit, but then he's too powerful. He overcomes it and starts to beat on the League. But I definitely think that that's an aspect of Superman's uh, well, I was gonna say powers, but like weaknesses, I suppose, that James Gunn is most likely well aware of and will try to show us, and maybe through the Authority somehow. But like we'll see.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, Paradise Lost there's a lot of potential. There's so many of these projects that we've been talking about, we'll continue to talk about, that have almost infinite potential, which as a lot of projects do. But like some projects they announce them, and you're like, well, did you like the Birds of Prey, for example? There were those kind of decisions were being made back then, where they would announce a project at Warner Brothers for DC, and we'd be like, did we really do we really want that? Did anybody really want that? And sometimes, yes, it turns into something great. Sometimes, and other times, it's like, yeah, nobody really wanted that. That's why nobody went and saw it.
It's
Um,
funny because like a lot of the canceled projects would have been more interesting than the official projects. It's like we could have gotten a Guillermo del Toro Justice League Dark movie. Like, why did that not happen? Like,
yeah.
what?
Well,
Fuck,
I think
guys.
because at the time they weren't as open to doing like standalones until like Joker became a huge hit and the Batman then became a thing. They were probably, I think, because Guillermo del Toro was like, I need to just do my own thing. Like, I'm not going to work within the constraints of like a larger picture story kind of thing. And I
Sure, I
think they
guess.
were swinging in that direction. But yeah, I mean, look, honestly, I would love for them to kind of build up in this Paradise Lost to even like eventually having a war with the Lanteans, and maybe that happens in the
That could be true.
ancient past. Maybe it's not a present day thing. I mean, you would maybe miss Aquaman and Wonder Woman, and I think in the Walter Hamada, he was building up towards an event like that. Well, while the DCU was still a thing, but now that that's out of the that's gone, done and dusted. I still would love to see that in live action one day. The Lanteans and the Amazons going to war. Maybe that could be a Lanteans versus Amazon, Dawn of Justice kind of a movie where eventually like a bigger bad guy shows up in the end and they kind of come together to fight. Maybe that's where new gods come in. Who knows? Anyway, we can talk about this all day, guys. Let us know in the comments what do you think about this. Paradise Lost is a show that is on the way, and much like a lot of the projects that the new DCU has on its plate in Chapter One, Gods and Monsters, it's got a lot of potential. It's a show that a lot of us have been looking forward to. We'll continue to look forward to. It's a show that also we don't have a date for yet. Like it's not in production. They haven't really cast for it yet, but I'm sure they're working on it in the background. There's only so much they can do at the same time, and of course with the strikes, I'm sure a lot of things were delayed. But let us know in the comments what you think about Paradise Lost. Are you looking forward to seeing that show become something that's going to be maybe a modern classic, something that's maybe a cross between a Wonder Woman movie and Game of Thrones, or something different entirely. Maybe we go more of the Xena the Warrior Princess, or something a little more magical and grungy. But let us know in the comments what you think, what you would like to see, and of course, leave your comments in the live chat if you're watching us live. We'll do our best to respond to your questions while we're on the air, and then of course, if you miss your question while we're on the air, then we'll try to answer it tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about Waller, another show that is coming up in the new DCU. So we'll see you then. Until next time, it's been nice talking to you, and keep checking back here. Like and subscribe. That really helps us out with the algorithm. If you, of course, enjoy the videos, and give us your ideas in the comments, because we would love to try anything and talk about stuff that you want to talk about. So check back here on DCU Daily tomorrow at 5:30. And until then, we'll see you next time.